Well, social psychology class, this is our last chapter of the semester. This is actually my favorite chapter of the entire book. It's my area of research, and I'm sad that we can't discuss it together, but hopefully you enjoy the lecture anyway. So this chapter, as you already know, because hopefully you already read it, talks about 5 big questions. In this first mini lecture, we'll talk about attraction. In the second mini lecture, we'll talk about the 2 most popular theories to explain how people behave in relationships. And then in the last mini lecture, we'll talk about how men and women might act differently and an explanation for why that is within relationships. So let's talk about attraction. There are 3 basic predictors of interpersonal attraction according to lots of areas of research. The first is that we're more likely to want to be friends with or date people who are similar to ourselves. So you've probably heard the term opposites attract. Research shows that's not actually true, that we prefer to hang out with people who validate our own views, who share our basic religious beliefs or ethical beliefs or goals in life, like somebody who does or doesn't want to have children, wants to live in a city versus the country. So we like to pair with people who are similar to ourselves in these major ways. A term that we have in social psychology for that is called assortative mating. Assortative mating basically means that you will end up matching up with someone, dating someone, potentially marrying someone who aligns with you and is similar to you in a lot of these major ways. An example is that assortative mating often works out such that you end up marrying someone who's about the same level of physical attractiveness as you as well. So 10s are more likely to marry other 10s if you're thinking about physical attractiveness on a scale of 1 to 10, right? So 10s end up marrying other 10s, 9s end up marrying other 9s, and so on down the list. So if you're interested in knowing about how attractive you are or how attractive you think you are, think about the people you date and how attractive they are. A second finding from research is what we call the mere exposure effect. The mere exposure effect in general is the idea that we tend to like things the more we're around them, or like people the more we're around them. Now, importantly, this is only true if you start from a neutral place. So if you start from a place where you don't like a song or a piece of art or a person, if that kind of like rubs you the wrong way, the more you're around it, the more you might actually dislike it. But assuming that you start from a place of neutrality, the more you're around something, the more you're going to like it. An interesting study that was done to test this effect is called the Westgate Housing Study. So this is a famous study that was done on the campus of MIT, and they were looking at basically like the apartment housing complexes for graduate students. You can see here there's a drawing of what the apartments looked like for the graduate students at MIT the year that this study was done. And all of the apartment buildings looked exactly the same. They all had 10 apartments on 2 floors. And you can see here that basically they had staircases going up on each side of the apartment. So if you look at the apartments numbered 1 through 10 here, what they did in the study was they asked each resident of each apartment building to rate how much they liked all of their neighbors at the beginning of the semester and then at the end of the semester. Beginning of the semester, people were pretty neutral about all of their neighbors because they didn't really know them very well. So the question was, by the end of the semester, who are you going to like the most? And what they found is that the people who lived in apartments number 1 and number 5 were liked the most, and the people in apartments number 6 and number 10 were liked the least. And this was true across almost every single building. So it didn't matter who those actual people were. The same pattern was found in every building. 1 and 5 were liked, 6 and 10 were not liked. And the conclusion from the study was that the reason 1 and 5 were liked is because you have to physically pass those apartment buildings or those apartment doors the most. So if you're walking from this direction, you're going to always pass apartment number 1. If you're walking from this direction, you're always going to pass apartment number 5, right? And 6 and 10 are liked the least because unless you live there, you have no reason to actually pass that door. So you just get to know those people as well, so you don't like them as much. Okay, the third factor in terms of attraction is called the excitation transfer effect. And this is the idea that we perceive physiological arousal in our bodies as attraction. So if I have noticed that whenever I'm around you, my heart rate increases and I sweat a little bit and I feel a little bit nervous, that might be interpreted as attraction to you, right? So my body is responding to you. The excitation transfer effect is a really interesting hypothesis that maybe if my body were physiologically aroused for a different reason, not actual attraction, but because of something else going on in my environment, I might transfer that excitation to the perception that I'm attracted to you. So I might misinterpret my physiological arousal as attraction. Let me talk about a famous study that tested this idea, and hopefully it'll help you understand it. So the famous study is called the Shaky Bridge Study by Dutton and Aaron. So what they did was they went to a national park that's up in New England. It's on the border of New England and Canada, actually. And in this state park, there is a bridge. There are actually two bridges. One of the bridges is this one here on the left. It's a low bridge. You can see that it's very close to the ground. It's very sturdy as well. So walking across this bridge feels very safe and leisurely. The other bridge looks like this. It's basically like an Indiana Jones bridge. It's a suspension bridge. It's a 40-foot drop to the bottom, and the bottom is basically like a bunch of rocks. And so if you fell off this bridge, it would be bad news for you. So the idea is walking across bridge number 1 feels safe. Your body's not going to get physiologically aroused by that. It's very kind of calm. This bridge, you might get excited physiologically because you're nervous. You're a little bit afraid of this bridge. So the idea is, would walking across bridge number 2 increase your physiological arousal? And could you interpret that arousal as attraction to someone who happens to be standing there? What Dutton and Aaron did is they had a graduate student who was a woman basically just hang out by bridge number 1 and bridge number 2 all day. She spent the half of the day at bridge 1 and half the day at bridge 2. She waited for men who were by themselves to walk across either bridge. After they had walked across the bridge, she approached them with a clipboard and said, "I'm working on behalf of the Parks Department, and I'm wondering if you could just fill out this one-page survey about your perception of the park today." And everybody did that. And then after they did that, she flirted with the guy, basically, and said, "If you're interested in talking to me a little bit more, here's my phone number." And she wrote it down on the edge of the paper and tore it off. So it looks like she doesn't do this for everyone, right? Even though she did. She gave the phone number to the guy. So the trick of the study is she flirted with every guy who walked across the bridge who was by himself, and she gave a different phone number to the guys who were at bridge number 1 versus bridge number 2. So then they had answering machines set up to measure how many of the guys actually called her. And what they found is that more guys called the bridge number 2 phone number compared to the bridge number 1 phone number. So they interpreted this finding as guys who had just walked across this super scary bridge and then met this woman who flirted with them and gave them her phone number. Maybe they interpreted their physiological arousal, which was really because of walking across the bridge, as attraction to this woman. It was the same woman in bridge number 1 and bridge number 2. So the fact that she got more calls from the guys who had just walked across the second bridge compared to the first bridge had to have been because they had just walked across the bridge, according to Dutton and Aaron. Now, there are other interpretations of these findings. Some people have said, well, maybe the guys who walked across this second bridge were already sort of more adventurous or more risk-taking. So they were more willing to call a woman that they had just met, right? So it wasn't walking across the bridge, it was something about their personality. So the study has been interpreted in a couple of different ways, but it's still a famous study because of the possibility that you might misinterpret your own body. So the way that this could be used in real life is, let's say you're going on a first date, right, and you want your date to be attracted to you. So you might want to take your date to something like a haunted house or a carnival where you're going to ride these scary rides, or take them to a horror movie, a scary movie, where their arousal is going to go up, and then maybe they'll interpret that arousal as attraction to you. So it's kind of a way to manipulate your date, right? Okay. We also know that, of course, physical attraction matters. So there are some studies that look at whether there are universal traits that are considered physically attractive. So no matter what culture or part of the world are you from, there are some things that pretty much every human finds physically attractive. So cross-cultural universals. The argument is that if we can find some of these universally attractive features, then maybe it's evidence of an evolutionary instinct in the human race to be attracted to these particular traits because it's good for our genetic survival. So here are a couple of examples. The first is called bilateral symmetry. The idea is if you split a person vertically, the left half of their body should be symmetric to the right half of their body. So this is research done by a woman named Gangstad, and you can go to her research lab and learn more about this if you're interested. But the idea is that if you look at photographs of people that she can manipulate with the computer, you can see here, this is a real portrait of a person. This is a portrait of a person that the computer has generated where they took the left half of the face and then just mirrored it with the computer. And this is the same person with the right half of the face, and then the computer mirrored it. And you can see here that in this particular set of photographs for this particular person, they all look pretty close to each other. So you can see that this person has a pretty high level of bilateral symmetry because the photos all look pretty close. So the argument is that we would perceive this person as pretty physically attractive because we have an instinct to appreciate bilateral symmetry. So I'll talk about why in just a second, but here are a couple of other interesting photos from her lab. You can see here that this woman she's starting to look a little bit weird in my opinion. Her angles of her face are kind of interesting, but you can see that she is fairly symmetric. Of course, hairstyle affects it a little bit. This woman, I think, is also pretty symmetric. This guy is starting to get a little creepy now for me. He looks kind of like a Terminator or something like that, like a robot from the future who's going to murder us. But you can start to see that he's not quite as symmetric as some of the photos we've already seen. I like this woman because of her hairstyle. I think she looks like someone I would want to know. But you can see just some examples. So the research shows that people who have more symmetry are more attractive, and that seems to be true around the world. One interesting study that was done using this idea of symmetry is that you can have a computer look at a photograph, a real photograph of someone who hasn't been adjusted by a computer. But what the software can do is actually measure how much symmetry is in somebody's face. So are the eyes the same size? Are they the same distance apart from the nose, right? Are the eyebrows the same amount of hairy, right? So we can see how symmetric your face is. And one study actually put pictures of celebrities into the computer and found that most celebrities who are considered kind of handsome or beautiful, right, they maybe are considered physically attractive because they have a high amount of symmetry. So here are some examples. So basically we have here Meryl Streep, and you can see that the photos are all pretty similar. So she probably has pretty high amount of symmetry. This is Lucy Liu. She's a beautiful woman. You can see that she's probably got a pretty high amount of symmetry here. Halle Berry, of course, a gorgeous woman. You can see here almost all of the photos look exactly the same. So this is again indicating a high amount of symmetry. By the way, fun fact, the actor in the study who was found to have the highest amount of symmetry was, drum roll, Denzel Washington. So Denzel Washington is considered a very attractive man. You can see here again, maybe one side of his face is a little bit thicker than the other, but he's got a pretty high amount of symmetry. So just so you know, I've got a little crush on Denzel. No, I'm just kidding, I'm married. But the idea is that symmetry is considered attractive. Follow-up studies have shown that this symmetry is not only perceived as attractive by other people, but it actually also might help you get potential sexual partners. So an example of this is that Thornhill and Gangstad brought in men and women and measured not just their facial symmetry, but their entire body symmetry. So measure their feet. Are your feet the same size? Are your ankles the same size? Hands, wrists, elbows, ears, lots of different measures of symmetry. And then correlated the amount of symmetry found in the men and women from their study with how many lifetime sexual partners have you had and how old were you when you lost your virginity. So amount of lifetime sexual partners was positively correlated with your amount of symmetry, and it was negative. Symmetry was negatively correlated with your age of loss of virginity, basically. So the idea is that you're getting more sexual partners, and they're sort of approaching you earlier in life. So you're getting more opportunities if you have symmetry. So again, why is symmetry so attractive to us? From an evolutionary point of view, we know that symmetry is actually a cue for genetic health. So we might be attracted to it because it seems to be a sort of a cue that someone has good genes, and that might mean that they're a good sort of partner from an evolutionary point of view. We know that this is true in other species and not just humans. So for example, here's an article that talked about how swallows, the bird, and scorpion flies, the insect, they also are two species where they're attracted to symmetry in terms of mating perspectives, and that symmetry is tied to survival in these two species. If there's a drought, if there's a lack of food, if there are really fluctuating temperatures, individuals in these two species are more likely to survive if they have symmetry themselves. So again, symmetry seems to be a cue for good genetic health, and maybe that's why humans are attracted to other humans who have symmetry. Another interesting physical characteristic that seems to be universally appealing is what we call averaged faces. So this is when a computer program, again, can take, let's say it's 10 different individual photos of 10 different people, and then the computer morphs them all into a single photo. That morphed photo, which is going to be an average of all of the individual photos, is perceived to be more attractive than any of the individual photos. So you can see here as an example, we have here on the left, we have, we have a photo of two different women who were combined. We have here a photo that's 4 different women, 8, 16, and 32. And the argument is that if you ask people, is this 32 face is the 32 face averaged image, is that more or less attractive than the 2 face? And people find the more faces you have, the more attractive it is. So people would say that the photo here on the right, the 32 face, is more attractive than the 2 face, even though they're not necessarily told that it's a morphed face. Okay, the last one, let me go back to one more thing on the averaged faces. So again, people have asked, why is that attractive? Some people have said it's because if you just look at individual faces, there often will be some sort of unique aspects to it. So like maybe you have a mole, or maybe one of your eyes is bigger than the other, something like that. So the argument is that the reason that we find the averaged faces more attractive is because it kind of smooths out any of those unique qualities that might be sort of off-putting. Another idea is that the symmetry faces are actually, the average faces are actually more attractive because they're more symmetric. So this is really just kind of a secondary way to measure symmetry, because the more faces we put in there, the more symmetric the averaged face will be. So there's a little bit of debate on why we happen to find the averaged faces more attractive. The last thing that we'll talk about in this first mini lecture is body shape, basically. So of course, everyone has different types in terms of, do you want someone who's a little bit thicker? Do you want someone who's a little bit thinner? That varies. But what seems to be universal is the actual body proportion or ratio of different parts of the body that people tend to find attractive. So when we are judging the attractiveness of women across the world, around the world, a 0.7 waist to shoulders ratio seems, sorry, I got my two mixed up here. Okay, so let's start with men. So for men, we want basically a V shape when we're looking at the waist to the shoulders, right? So that sort of broad shoulders idea for men. So with that muscular arms and shoulders. So we want that traditional V shape when we're talking about guys. The 0.7 is if you measured a guy's circumference of his waist, and then you measured the circumference of his shoulders, you would want the waist to be 70% of the shoulders. For women, it's we want a V shape, but it's the bottom half of the body. So basically we want there to be kind of an hourglass shape for women, right? But what matters most is actually the waist to the hips. So now we want a 70% ratio of the waist is 70% of the hips, right? So again, it's 0.7, but for guys, it's the top half of the body, and for women, it's the bottom half of the body. So why is this attractive? The idea is that from an evolutionary perspective, again, we're talking about survival of our ancestors, our genetic ancestors. That women, so we're talking about heterosexuality here, first of all. The idea is that heterosexual women would want men with this V shape in their waist to shoulders because it indicates physical strength. And the idea is, if you think about like cave women and cavemen, basically, a woman would want a guy who's physically strong because you need the guy to protect you from predators, you need the guy to go out and hunt for you, right? So you need a guy who's physically strong. You want the smaller waist because you want him to be sort of aerobically fit, right? For women, heterosexual men are going to be attracted to women with this bottom half V because, again, you want a small waist to show sort of aerobic fitness, but wide hips indicate good birthing, basically. So she's sort of fertile, she's got the wide hips, she's bootylicious, so she's attractive to you as a heterosexual man because she has the body type of basically healthy birthing, so she'll be a good mate for you in terms of producing children. Okay, so again, this seems to be popular and attractive around the world. Doesn't matter what kind of culture you're from. The V shape for guys and the hourglass, especially that bottom half, the bigger hips in women, seems to be attractive no matter what culture you're from. So that's it for the first mini lecture. Several different ideas of why we're attracted to other people. Some things you might not have thought about, like symmetry, but interesting findings from social psychology. In the next mini lecture, we'll talk about once you're actually in a relationship, what are some ideas for how do you act the way that you do. See you then.